Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to discuss about foreign direct investment or FDI in short. FDI occurs when a firm invests directly in facilities to produce or market a product in a foreign country. Once a firm undertakes FDI, it becomes a multinational enterprise or MNE. FDI takes on two forms. The first is a greenfield investment, which involves the establishment of a new operation in a foreign country. The second involves acquiring or merging with an existing firm in a foreign country. The most cross-border investment is in a form of mergers and acquisitions rather than greenfield investments. Why do firms choose acquisition versus greenfield investments? Firms prefer to acquire existing assets because they know that doing merging and acquiring investments are quicker to execute rather than doing greenfield investments. It is also easier and perhaps less risky for a firm to acquire desired assets than build them from the ground up. And firms believe that they can increase the efficiency of an acquiring unit by transferring capital, technology, or management skills. When discussing foreign direct investment, it is important to distinguish between flow of FDI and the stock of FDI. The flow of FDI refers to the amount of FDI undertaken over a given period of time, normally a year, while the stock of FDI refers to the total accumulated value of foreign owned assets at a given time. We also talk of outflows of FDI, meaning the flow of FDI out of a country, and inflows of FDI, the flow of FDI into a country. Both the flow and stock of FDI have increased over the last 30 years. So as shown in this figure, the past 30 years have seen a marked increase in both the flow and stock of FDI in the world economy. The average yearly outflow of FDI increased from $25 billion in 1975 to a record of $1.8 trillion in 2007. However, FDI outflows did contract to $1.1 trillion in 2009 and 2010 in the wake of the global financial crisis, although they were forecasted to recover in 2011. So, in general, over the past 30 years, the flow of FDI has accelerated faster. FDI has grown more rapidly than world trade and world output for several reasons. First, despite the general decline in trade barriers over the past 30 years, firms still fear protectionist pressures. Executives see FDI as a way of circumventing future trade barriers. Second one is that much of the increase in FDI has been driven by the political and economic changes that have been occurring in many of the world's developing nations. Across much of Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, economic growth, economic deregulation, privatization programs that are open to foreign investors, and removal of many restrictions on FDI have made these countries more attractive to foreign multinationals. According to UN, some 90% of the 2,700 changes made worldwide between 1992 to 2009 in the laws governing foreign direct investment created a more favorable environment for FDI. Then, in the early 2000s, the number of regulations that are less favorable toward FDI has increased, suggesting the pendulum may be starting to swing the other way. In Latin America, for example, two-thirds of the reported changes in 2005 and 2009 made the environment for foreign direct investment less welcome. Most of these unfavorable changes were focused on extractive industries such as oil and gas, where governments seemed to focus on limiting FDI and capturing more of the economic value from FDI through, for example, higher taxes and royalty rates applied to foreign enterprises. Recent adverse development in some nations, the general desire of the governments to facilitate FDI also has been reflected in a sharp increase in the number of bilateral investment treaties designed to protect and promote investment between two countries. The globalization of the world economy is also having a positive impact on the volume of FDI. Many firms such as Walmart in US now see the whole world as their market, and they are undertaking FDI in an attempt to make sure they have a significant presence in many regions of the world. For a reason that we shall explore later in this subject, that many firms now believe it is important to have production facilities based close to their major customers. Historically, most FDI has been directed at the developed nations of the world as firms based in advanced countries invested in the other markets. As we observe in this figure, during 1980s and 1990s, US was often the favorite target for FDI inflows. The United States has been an attractive target for FDI because of its large and wealthy domestic markets, its dynamic and stable economy, a favorable political environment, and openness of the country to FDI. Investors include firms based in Great Britain, Japan, Germany, Netherlands, and France. Inward investment into the US remained high during 2000s, although it fell to almost $2 billion in 2010 in the wake of the global financial crisis. The developed nations of the European Union have also been recipients of significant FDI inflows, particularly from US and Japanese enterprises and from other member states of the EU. Even though developed nations still account for the largest share of FDI inflows, FDI into developing nations has increased as we observe in the figure. From 1985 to 1990, the annual inflow of FDI into developing nations averaged 27.4 billion US dollars, or it is 17.4% of the total global flow. In the mid to late 1990s, the inflow into developing nations was generally between 35 and 40% of the total, before falling back to account for about 25% of the total in the 2000 to 2002 period, and then climbing to hit a record 50% in 2010. Most recent inflows into developing nations have been targeted at the emerging economies in South Asia, East Asia, or even here in Southeast Asia. So what is the source of FDI? Since World War II, the United States has been the largest source of country for FDI, a position it retained during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Other important source countries like UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, and Japan. Collectively, these six countries accounted for 60% of all FDI outflows from 1998 up to 2010. As might be expected, that these countries also predominate in rankings of the world's largest multinationals. So these nationals dominate primarily because they were the most developed nations with the largest economies during much of the post-war period, and therefore home to many of the largest and best capitalized enterprises. Many of these countries also had a long history as trading nations and naturally looked to foreign markets to fuel their economic expansion. Thus, it is no surprise that enterprise based there have been at the forefront of foreign investment trades. In this section, we review several theories of foreign direct investment. So these theories approach the various phenomena of foreign direct investment from three complementary perspectives. Why do firms go to all of the trouble of establishing operations abroad through foreign direct investment when exporting and licensing are available to them for exploiting the profit opportunities in the foreign market? Exporting involves producing goods at home and then shipping them to the receiving country for sale, while licensing involves granting a foreign entity, the licensee, the right to produce and sell the firm's product in return for a royalty fee on every unit sold. The question is important given that a cursory examination of the topic suggests that FDI may be both expensive and risky compared with exporting and licensing. The limitation of this exporting is that the viability of an export strategy is often constrained by transportation costs and trade barriers. When transportation costs are added to production costs, it becomes unprofitable to ship some products over a large distance. This is particularly true of products that have a low value to weight ratio and that can be produced in almost any location. For such products, the attractiveness of exporting decreases relative to either FDI or licensing. This is the case with cement. For example, a cement or Mexican cement maker, which is Cemex, has expanded internationally by pursuing FDI rather than exporting. For products with high value to weight ratio, transportation costs are normally a minor component of total landed cost. For example, we have electronic components, personal computers, medical equipment, computer software, and so on. And it has a little impact on the relative attractiveness of exporting, licensing, and FDI. While the limitation of licensing is that here we have internationalization theory that seeks to explain why firms often prefer FDI over licensing as a strategy for entering foreign markets, or this approach is also known as the market imperfections theory. So, according to internationalization theory, licensing has three major drawbacks. So, these are the possible limitations of licensing. One is that licensing may result in a firms giving away valuable technological know-how to a potential foreign competition or a potential foreign competitor. The second problem is that licensing does not give a firm the tight control over manufacturing, marketing, and strategy in a foreign country that may be required to maximize its profitability. Another problem, or the third problem with licensing, when the firm's competitive advantage is based not as much on its products as on the management, marketing, and manufacturing capabilities than produce those products. The problem here is that such capabilities are often not amenable to licensing. One theory is based on the idea that FDI flows are the reflection of strategic rivalry between firms in the global marketplace. An early variant of this argument was expounded by F.T. Knickerbocker, who looked at the relationship between FDI and rivalry in oligopolistic industry. An oligopoly is an industry composed of a limited number of large firms. A critical competitive feature of such industries is interdependent of the major players. What one firm does can have an immediate impact on the major competitors, forcing a response in kind. Let's say by cutting prices, one firm in a oligopoly can take market share away from its competitors, forcing them to respond with similar price cuts to retain their market share. Thus, the interdependence between firms in an oligopoly leads to imitative behavior. Rivals often quickly imitate what a firm does in an oligopoly. Another one is that Knickerbocker's theory can be extended to embrace the concept of multi-point competition. Multi-point competition arises when two or more enterprises encounter each other in different regional markets, national markets, or industries. Let's say, for example, Kodak and Fuji, photo film company, for example, compete against each other around the world. If Kodak enters a particular foreign market, Fuji will not be far behind. Fuji feels compelled to follow Kodak to ensure that Kodak does not gain a dominant position in a foreign market that it could then leverage to gain a competitive advantage elsewhere. The converse also holds with Kodak following Fuji when the Japanese firm is the first to enter a foreign market. Another one is that Raymond Vernon's product life cycle theory is used to explain FDI. Vernon argued that often the same firms that pioneer a product in their home markets undertake FDI to produce a product for consumption in a foreign markets. Thus, let's say Xerox introduced the photocopier in the US, and it was Xerox that set up production facilities in Japan, that in the case of Fuji, and Great Britain in the case of Rank, to serve those markets. Vernon's view is that firms undertake FDI as or at a particular stages in the life cycle of a product they have pioneered. They invest in the other advanced countries when local demand on those countries grows large enough to support local production, as the Xerox did. They subsequently shift production to developing countries when product standardization and market saturation gave rise to price competition and cost pressures. Investment in developing countries where labor costs are lower is seen as the best way to reduce costs. Another one is that the eclectic paradigm has been championed by the British economist John Dunning. Dunning argues that in addition to the various factors, location-specific advantages are also of considerable importance in explaining both the rationale for and the direction of foreign direct investments. By local specific advantages, Dunung or Dunning means the advantages that arise from utilization or utilizing resource endowments or assets that are tied to particular foreign location and that a firm finds valuable to combine with its own unique assets. An obvious example of Duning's arguments are those natural resources like oil and other minerals, which are by their character specific to certain locations. Another obvious example is the valuable human resources, such as low cost, highly skilled labor. However, Duning's theory has implications that go beyond basic resources like minerals and labor. Consider an example in the Silicon Valley in US, which is the world center for the computer and semiconductor industries. Many of the world's major computer and semiconductor companies such as Apple Computer, Hewlett Packard, and Intel are located close to each other in the Silicon Valley region of California. As a result, much of the cutting-edge research and product development in computers and semiconductors occurs there. According to Duning's arguments, knowledge being generated in Silicon Valley with regard to the design and manufacture of computers and semiconductors is available nowhere else in the world. To be sure, as it is commercialized, then knowledge diffuses throughout the world, but the leading edge of the knowledge generation in the computer and semiconductor industries is to be found in Silicon Valley. In Duning's language, this means that Silicon Valley has a location-specific advantage in generation of knowledge related to the computer and semiconductor industries. In part, this advantage comes from the sheer concentration of intellectual talent in this area, and in part, it arises from the network of informal contacts that allow firms to benefit from each other's knowledge generation. Economists refer to these knowledge spillovers as externalities, and there is a well-established theory suggesting that firms can benefit from such externalities by locating close to their source. In this section, political ideology toward FDI within a nation has ranged from a dogmatic radical stance that is hostile to all inward FDI at one extreme to an adherence to the non-interventionist principle of free market economics at the other. Between these two extremes is an approach that might be called pragmatic nationalism. The radical view traces its roots to Marxist political and economic theory. Radical right, writers argue that the MNE is an instrument of imperialist domination. They see the MNE as a tool of exploiting host countries to the exclusive benefit of their capitalist imperialist home countries. They argue that MNEs extract profits from the host country and take them to their home country, giving nothing of value to the host country in exchange. Another one is the free market view traces its roots to classical economics and the international trade theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The intellectual case for this view has been strengthened by the internationalization explanation of FDI. The free market view argues the international production should be distributed among countries according to the theory of comparative advantage. Countries should specialize in the production of those goods and services that they can produce most efficiently. Within this framework, the MNE is an instrument for dispersing the production of goods and services to the most efficient locations around the world. FDI by the MNE increases the overall efficiency of the world economy. In practice, most countries have adopted neither a radical policy nor a free market policy towards FDI, but instead a policy can be described best as pragmatic nationalism. The pragmatic nationalist view is that FDI has both benefits and costs. FDI can benefit a host country by bringing capital, skills, technology, and jobs, but those benefits come at a cost. When a foreign company rather than a domestic company produces products, the profits from that investment go abroad. Many countries are also concerned that a foreign owned manufacturing plant may import many components from its home country, which has negative implications for the host country's balance of payment position. What does FDI mean for the host countries? To greater or lesser degree, many governments can be considered pragmatic nationalists when it comes to FDI. According, their policy is shaped by consideration of the costs and benefits of FDI. So here, we're going to explore the benefits and costs of FDI first from the perspective of a host country and then from the perspective of the home or the source country. So for the host country, the main benefits of inward FDI arise from resource transfer effects, employment effects, balance of payment effects, and the effects on competition and economic growth. Number one here is that there is a resource transfer effects. Foreign direct investment can make a positive contribution to a host economy by supplying capital, technology, and management resources that would otherwise not be available and thus boost that country's economic growth rate. With regard to capital, many MNEs, by virtue of their large size and financial strength, have access to financial resources not available to host country firms. These funds may be available from internal company sources or because of their reputation. Large MNEs may find it easier to borrow money from capital markets than host country firms would. Next is the employment effects that claim that FDI brings jobs to a host country that would otherwise not be created there. The effects of FDI on employment are both could be direct and indirect. Direct effects arise when a foreign MNE employs a number of host country citizens, while indirect effects arise when jobs are created in local suppliers as a result of the investment and when jobs are created because of increased local spending by employees of the MNE. Then we have the balance of payments effects. So F- FDI's effect on a country's balance of payments accounts is an important policy issue for most host governments. A country's balance of payments accounts track both of its payments to and its receipts from other countries. Governments normally are concerned when their country is running a deficit on the current account of their balance of payments. The current account tracks the export and import of goods and services. Current account deficit or trade deficit, as it is often called, it will arise when a country is importing more goods and services rather than exporting. Governments typically prefer to set a current account surplus rather than to have a deficit. The only way in which a current account deficit can be supported in the long run is by selling off assets to foreigners. There are possible three causes of FDI concern host countries here. They arise from possible adverse effects on the competition within the host nation, adverse effects on the balance of payments, and the perceived loss of national sovereignty and autonomy. One, there is a adverse effects on competition within the host nation. So host governments sometimes worry that the subsidiaries of foreign MNEs may have greater economic power rather than those local competitors. If it is part of a larger international organization, the foreign MNE may be able to draw on funds generated elsewhere to subsidize its costs in the host market, which could drive local companies out of the business and allow the firm to monopolize the market. Once the market is monopolized, the foreign MNE could raise prices above those that would prevail in the competitive markets, with harmful effects on the economic welfare of a host nation. This concern tends to be greater in countries that have few large firms of their own. Next is the adverse effects on the balance of payments. So, the possible adverse effects of FDI could be in a twofold. First is that set against the initial capital inflow that comes with FDI must be the subsequent outflow of earnings from the foreign subsidiary to its parent company. Such outflows show up as a capital outflow on balance of payment accounts. Some governments have responded to such outflows by restricting the amount of earnings that can be repatriated to a foreign subsidiary's home country. The second concern arises when a foreign subsidiary imports a substantial number of its inputs from abroad, which results to a debit on the current account of the host country's balance of payments. The last is that perceived loss of national sovereignty and autonomy. So the concern is that key decisions that can affect the host country's economy will be made by a foreign parent that has no real commitment to the host country and over which the host country's government has no real control. Thus, most economists dismiss such concerns as a groundless and irrational. How about FDI mean for the home country? Against these benefits must be set the apparent cost of FDI from the home or the source country. The most important concerns center in the balance of payments and employment effects of outward FDI. Here is that there are three possible benefits of this FDI from the home country, which includes one, the positive effect on the capital account from the inward flow of foreign earnings. The balance of payments suffer from the initial capital outflow required to finance the FDI. So this effect is usually more than offset by the subsequent inflow of foreign earnings. The second one is that the current account of the balance of payments suffers if the purpose of foreign investment is to serve the home market from a low-cost production location. And the third is that the current account of the balance of payments suffers if the FDI is substituted from direct exports. And then the second one is that the employment effects that arise from the outward FDI. The most serious concern arise when FDI is seen as a substitute for domestic production. This was the case, for example, with Toyota's investment in the United States and Europe. One obvious result of such FDI is reduced home country employment. If the labor market in the home country is already tight with little unemployment, this concern may not be that great. And number three is the gains from learning valuable skills from foreign markets that can subsequently be transferred back to the home country. What are the possible causes of FDI for the home country? One is there is a negative effect on the balance of payments. Then the second one is employment may also be negatively affected if the FDI is a substitute for domestic production. So we have now reviewed the costs and benefits of FDI from the perspective of both home country and the host country. We now turn our attention to the policy instruments that home countries and host countries can use to regulate FDI. For the home country policies, governments can encourage outward FDI. We look at policies designed to encourage outward FDI first. So these include foreign risk insurance, capital assistance, tax incentives, and political pressure. Then we will look at policies designed to restrict outward FDI. So here is that many investor nations now have government-backed insurance programs to cover major types of foreign investment risk. The types of risk insurable through these programs include the risk of expropriation or nationalization, war losses, and the inability to transfer profits back home. So such programs are particularly useful in encouraging firms to undertake investments in political unstable countries. Next is governments can restrict outward FDI. All investor countries like US have exercised some control over outward FDI from time to time. One policy has been to limit capital outflows out of concern for the country's balance of payments. From the early 1960s up to 1979, for example, Britain had exchange control regulations that limited the amount of capital a firm could take out of the country. Although the main intent of such policies was to improve the British balance of payments, an important secondary intent was to make it difficult for British firms to undertake FDI. In addition, countries have occasionally manipulated tax rules to try to encourage their firms to invest at home. The objective behind such policies is to create jobs at home rather than in other nations. For the host country policies, the government can encourage inward FDI. It is common for the governments to offer incentives to foreign firms to invest in their countries. Such incentives take many forms, but the most common are tax concessions or tax reduction, low interest loans, and grants or subsidies. Incentives are motivated by a desire to gain from the resource transfer and employment effects of FDI. They are also motivated by a desire to capture FDI away from the other potential host countries. The next is that the governments can restrict inward FDI. So the host governments use a wide range of controls to restrict FDI in one way or another. The two most common are the ownership restraints or limitations and performance requirements. These ownership restraints can take several forms. In some countries, foreign companies are excluded from specific fields. Let's say they are excluded from tobacco and mining in Sweden and from the development of certain natural resources in Brazil, Finland, and Morocco. In other industries, foreign ownership may be permitted, although a significant proportion of the equity of the subsidiary must be owned by the local investors. Foreign ownership is restricted to 25% or less of an airline in the industry. In the Philippines, according to 1987 Philippine Constitution, we follow the 60-40 rule, wherein 60 must be coming from the Filipino-owned, while 40% must be coming from the foreign-owned. Then the performance requirements can also take several forms. Performance requirements are controls over the behavior of the MNE's local subsidiary. But the most common performance requirements are related to local content, exports, technology transfer, and local partition in top management. What does FDI mean for managers? There are several implications for business are inherent in this discussion. So in this section, we deal first with the implication of the theory and then turn our attention to the implications of government policy. So managers here need to consider what trade theory implies about FDI and the link between government policy and FDI. The direction of FDI can be explained through the location-specific advantages argument associated with John Dunning. And then the host government's attitude towards FDI is an important variable in decisions about where to locate foreign production facilities and where to make foreign direct investment.